Let me read to you a passage from the 21st chapter of St. John's Gospel, verses 1 to 19. It's the Gospel for the third Sunday of Eastertide, Year C. I shall only read part of it because it's a very long passage. St. John writes, "Afterwards Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberius. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. 'I'm going out to fish,' Simon Peter told them, and they said, 'We'll go with you.' So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, 'Friends, haven't you caught any fish?' 'No,' they answered. He said, 'Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some.' When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, 'It is the Lord.' As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, 'It is the Lord,' he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciple followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. Then they landed. They saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. Jesus said to them, 'Bring some of the fish you've just caught.' Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore." That's from John chapter 21, verses 1 to 19, at least part of it. What does it suggest to us? Well, it speaks, of course, of the resurrection. You know, the Oxford movement in the third decade of the 19th century England was, among other things, an attempt to restore the authority and spiritual life of the Anglican Church. This was understood by its leaders as requiring a recovery of the Catholic ethos of the early Church, as interpreted theologically by the Caroline divines of the 17th century. All acknowledge that John Henry Newman was its driving intellectual leader, and the elements of his thought continue to be the object of widespread research. Now, Newman saw clearly that the foe of the Christian faith was the rationalism of the time. The rationalism that Newman opposed insisted that the validity of faith and its tenets must be judged by the requirements of what they called reason. In effect, reason meant the formal requirements of logic and demonstration, such that if the believer could not demonstrate his case according to the canons of scientific proof, his case could not stand. He had no justification for believing. Jesus opposed this notion of the reasonable as being unreal. It was not how human beings arrived at valid conclusions and convictions. The human being becomes convinced of something not just because it can be demonstrated, but because of a host of factors that could be impossible to put into syllogistic form. Perhaps the most important factor, among others, leading a person to be convinced of something in real life is antecedent probability. For instance, a demonstration of the existence of God which might satisfy the demands of mere logical proof, of itself will not lead a person to personal conviction of its truth. Rather, what will be decisive will be his perception of the overwhelming probability of God, borne in on him by numerous converging factors, each of which in isolation might be but a probability. In isolation. What I am highlighting here, in this reference to Newman's thought, is the importance of antecedent probability in arriving at personal conviction. Of course, there are obvious dangers. If one thinks it is highly probable that something exists, or is happening, one could believe something for grounds that are not good. Nevertheless, the importance of Newman's position and point is obvious. We have a beautiful gospel scene before us that I read earlier, the scene of the risen Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. There he is as dawn is breaking, a lone figure whom the disciples see from their boat. He is soon recognized by the beloved disciple. But this recognition followed on their encounter with the risen Jesus back in Jerusalem on the day of his resurrection. Our scene today invites us to recall the frame of mind of our Lord's closest disciples, his apostles no less, following his terrible death and hasty burial on the Friday afternoon. A great gloom enveloped them, and during the entire Sabbath day that followed, a great darkness covered their souls. It was well represented by the two forlorn disciples leaving Jerusalem for Emmaus on the Sunday morning. They were joined by the risen Jesus, but failed to recognize him. The striking thing about the entire group of disciples, with the exception, we may be sure, of Christ's own mother, was their conviction that his death was the end. They did not have the slightest sense of the probability of his rising from the dead. He had spoken of this explicitly. He had foretold his rejection, his condemnation, his passion, his death, and had even foretold how he would die. It would be by crucifixion. But he had repeatedly said that he would also rise, and had specified that it would be on the third day. Nevertheless, they had no sense even of its probability, let alone of its certainty. They utterly lacked what Newman says is the principal factor leading to conviction in matters of real life, a sense of its antecedent probability. And because of this, they did not accept the various reports coming from reliable witnesses of his resurrection. They regarded it as overwhelmingly improbable, despite all they had seen and known of Jesus Christ and of what he had predicted. Thomas even refused to accept the joint witness of the other apostles until he saw our Lord. Why did they regard it as so improbable? Well, our Lord made it clear to them that it was due to the hardness of their hearts. It was due to moral factors. Newman also taught that in matters moral and religious, what a person accepts as likely will depend also on his moral state. Religious conviction or faith does not just depend on so-called reason. It depends on the state of our hearts, for this will shape what we consider to be probable. In turn, our sense of what is probable will shape our response to those many things that point to the truth of something. It was because of the state of their hearts that the apostles did not accept the news of the resurrection. In other words, the good news of the gospel. They regarded it as totally, utterly improbable. It was only when the fact of it was presented before their eyes that they became convinced. Let us ask our Lord to pour his grace into our hearts and make of them good soil for the great truth of the resurrection.